Hello, and thanks for joining us today for our representation in gaming panel. I'm joined by some fine folks today. We have Alex and Quinn Schultz and Pepper. We're going to talk today about what it means to be representative when we're talking about role-playing games. But before we dive in, I'd like to thank everybody who has donated to our two different charities so far. We've got Stack Up, which is a US-based charity that has been doing some great work in the field of providing games to veterans and their allies. And then a UK-based charity named Everyone Can, which also does some really amazing work with people with disabilities who are in the like video game and role-playing game spheres. So if you can continue to support these fantastic charities that we're raising awareness for, we would certainly appreciate it. The last time I checked, it was over $6,000 raised so far, and we're only just getting started. So thank you to everybody who's donated so far, and let's go ahead and dive in. So today we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. I am Jacob Wood. I'm the owner of Accessible Games, and I'll be facilitating this panel today. And with me, I have Alex. Alex, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm Alex. I am on the podcast A Couple of Characters with my wife Quinn, and she will introduce herself in a moment. And I am visually impaired, and I think that yeah, that's about all I need to say about myself. And I'll let Quinn talk about our show a little bit. So
Quinn?
All right, yes, I am Quinn. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the co host, editor, and producer of A Couple of Characters podcast, as well as a player on the Dungeons and Dragon Types podcast. And I've been playing role playing games since January of 2015 and been podcasting since 2020. And on A Couple of Characters, we make characters for role playing games and also discuss topics related to making characters for role playing games, like how to write a compelling backstory.
Awesome, thank you. And Pepper, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hello. I am Pepper. I am an electronic musician at Pepper the Vixen, and I make music and play Stardew Valley. I am fully blind myself, and I do tabletop role-playing games as well, though not as often. Video games are my thing.
Awesome, thank you. So we've got a nice breadth of experience here at the table between role-playing games and video games. I think that's fantastic that we are representing um, a different variety of interests as well as intersectional personalities and identities. Um, just as a brief note, we were going to have Aloy Lasanta from Third Eye Games joining us tonight as well, but he is in the Tampa, Florida region and was not able to join us due to the hurricane. And our thoughts go out to him and his family tonight as he is kind of weathering that storm. So we've got a little less than an hour for the whole panel. We'll go ahead and jump into some of our questions and start the discussion here. So for our first question, what does representation mean to you? And what does that mean to you exactly? Quinn, can you go ahead and get us started?
Yeah, so I think that as creators, we have a responsibility to represent everyone. If we only show one kind of person everywhere, then we're doing a disservice to the vast array of backgrounds and identities that encompass the human experience. And it is challenging to represent someone who isn't yourself because you really can only personally speak to your own experience and identity, which is why in our show we try to have guests from a variety of backgrounds with a variety of identities. And by talking to people from various backgrounds, you can learn how to respectfully and accurately represent others.
Yeah, thank you. Alex, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that Quinn said it all pretty well, but I think for me, I just a little something I wanted to add is that I think it's hard to do representation well for people like beyond your own personal experiences. So whenever I like am representing blind people, I'm really just saying these are my personal experiences as a visually impaired person,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not representing all visually impaired or blind people, but I'm doing my
Yeah.
best to represent, share my story, and hopefully that can connect with other people and, raise the awareness and representation in that way.
Thank you. I really appreciate you mentioning that, because no one group of people is a monolith, right? Like,
Mhm.
I might be blind, but I don't represent all blind people. And the same can be said for anybody with any identity. Nobody represents their entire culture. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Um, Pepper, what does representation mean to you?
Well, I mean, from the point of view of somebody who primarily consumes content, because I do make music, but it's mostly beeps and buzzes, and there's no real words to it. But to me, representation, it's being able to find yourself in a media. It's a way. It's what allows you to relate to the content that's being made, and you can go, hey, that's kind of cool. They're kind of like me. I enjoy this. It helps you helps us explore ourselves and diversify a little bit, seeing so many different identities out there.
That kind of is a great segue. Oh, I'm sorry. Did somebody have something else to say?
No, I think Alex just bumped our desk.
Yeah, sorry about
Oh,
that.
okay.
No, we're good. We're
No
good.
problem. That kind of is a really great segue into the next question. So, Pepper, I'll keep it focused on you for a moment. Why does representation matter? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, reason it's so important is you've got video games, you've got tabletop role playing games, and you can be playing as, I don't know, you can be an orc or a dwarf, or you can be like an orange block jumping over obstacles, or some anthropomorphic animal, or what have you. But at the end of the day, you're telling human stories about human experiences, and having good representation helps more people connect with those stories. It makes them more relatable to more people, and that's really cool because stories are great.
Awesome. Yeah. Alex, do you have anything you'd like to add? Why do you feel like representation matters?
I agree with Pepper, and I think that what they said there at the end really connected with me, because what I had thought for this question was that, it really helps us to hear different stories and learn about different people and their experiences, because then we can gain empathy and learn to relate to those people. And we also learn a lot of the time that people that might look really different on the surface are a lot more like us than we initially thought, or maybe that, that kind of thing. So it's nice to learn their stories and get a better understanding of the world at large.
Do you have anything that you'd like to add to that, Quinn?
The only thing I'd like to add, because you guys have kind of said everything about this, is if people never see themselves represented, they never think it's an option to do whatever. So they don't think I can tell my own story. Like, for example, if I'm a young girl and every doctor I've ever seen is a man, I don't think I can grow up to be a doctor. So it's really important to see people who are like you, like doing different things, so that way you can actually see, oh, I too can do those kinds of things.
Mm,
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
actually really important for children too.
Yeah.
Well, you all are masters of segues, because that goes really nicely then into the next question. If everything in the game is make believe anyway, why does it matter that we have representation in the material? After all, can't people just insert themselves the way that they want to? Who would like to take that one?
I can start.
Sure.
People deserve to play themselves in games, but the current systems lack a lot of diversity. And since a lot of the fantasy genre games included, are based on Lord of the Rings, which is very cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, white, and Eurocentric, it makes people think that that's the only kind of story they can tell. So, yes, people can insert themselves, but if they haven't seen anyone like them in a game, they might not even think to put themselves there. And some groups are, very big on only playing with published materials and rules as written, so they wouldn't even let you try to explore a different identity because they think, "Oh, I have to follow exactly what is there, and it doesn't exist in the official material, so I can't use that." And then the other thing I'd like to add is that newer players might be intimidated to try to come up with something new that represents themselves. So if we give them examples and opportunities to play things that more closely represent themselves, the onus isn't on them.
Right. I think that if I can jump off that,
Yeah, for sure.
what Quinn said initially there about if you don't see yourself represented, you might not think to insert yourself. I was playing tabletop RPGs for about 3 years before I ever even considered, oh, I could play a visually impaired person or a person with a disability in one of these games because I'd never seen it done. I'd been playing in very, you know, able-bodied worlds with heroes and that were probably all white and you know for
Mhm.
the most part cis and everything like that. So I was just playing in the typical D&D setting, and then I listened to a podcast that is really good on this topic called Three Black Halflings, and they were
Mm.
talking about how you can diversify your world by putting people of color in it. And I was thinking, oh, like, yes, this I never see people of color in my games, but also I don't see people with disabilities either. So it just kind of helped me expand my mind and realize that, oh, yes, we do need to put, you know, because it does sound dumb when I say, like, oh, I never even considered playing a blind character, but I really didn't. And it was, I think, a really eye-opening revelation when I thought about that for the first time and was like, oh, I should try to do this and play people with disabilities. And along this same time, I think, was when the combat wheelchair came out, and so that was another, I think, moment for us in the disabled community where we thought, oh, look, we could put ourselves in these games and it can be really cool.
That's awesome. I'm going to play devil's advocate for just a moment here and say, is that a failing on our part that we can't see ourselves in games without the designers taking their time to put people like us in those games?
I think definitely, I feel like, at least for me, it was a failing in myself that like I said, I never even really considered it. So I'm not entirely blaming the game designers, but I think things like the combat wheelchair or that kind of thing, once you put it in the books, it does help people realize, like, oh, there can be more to D&D than able-bodied heroes that are going through and doing their hero thing. We could have some heroes with disabilities, and they can be just as cool.
I think it's hard when the media at large doesn't have a lot of representation. So even though we should be able to think about ourselves and put ourselves in those kinds of places, it's just because we've been inundated with so many um, movies, TV shows, books, games, etc., that might not represent those kinds of experiences. We kind of internalize it and don't even think to try to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's sort of, is it safe to say that it's kind of a license to be more creative when the designers open that door for people?
I definitely think so.
I agree.
Cool. And Pepper, you said you primarily play video games. That's not a medium where people can really just insert themselves at will, right? How does that kind of interact with this idea of being able to just play what you want or see yourself as the character regardless of how they're portrayed in the game?
Yeah, video games, they're a little different. Sometimes you've got games with the silent protagonist type, like Half-Life, where you can think whatever you want of our hero Gordon Freeman. Sometimes not so much. They've got a personality of their own, and I don't see something that's inherently wrong with that because because it kind of lets you slip out of your own shoes for a bit. But that the places where you can have it is in all of the characters around you, the NPCs. What do they look like? What do they do? How do they talk? And all of that stuff. And I'd like to comment on what Quinn talked about earlier about representation in general, and the whole is it a failing on ourselves if we can't pick up on that? And I'd have to say not completely, because yeah, what we see in movies, what we see in books, what we see in TV shows, it leaves an impression on us. It leaves an impression on what other people are like. You see them and you think, I'm not like that. I don't have a super nice body, or maybe I don't have light skin, maybe I'm not cis, don't have the biggest guns, the fastest ships, etc., etc. And when you and like what all this does is it's it essentially what it's so helpful to have is this stuff that we've been talking about, because you get more options, more tools, more brushes, more ideas, more concepts to think about people and how everyone is different. And yes, you can play yourself in a game, and that's completely valid, but could be fun to try something else. Could give you a little insight to something new.
Yeah, for sure. You bring up an interesting point there. In a lot of games, we have like 1,000,001 feats and 1,001 ancestries or races or species or whatever you want to call them. We can play characters from anthropomorphic creatures, but how often do we really see characters who are maybe a halfling with a different skin color, or an orc who's not just green but a stand-in for Black culture? Uh, how is it that we can represent all of these different fantasy creatures and still somehow fail to see ourselves in any of that? And why is it so? Why do we get so much backlash when we suggest that maybe we should be able to? Has anybody encountered that kind of discussion online? I know it's kind of toxic to bring up sometimes, but what are
Yeah,
people's thoughts
so
on that?
as Alex said, Three Black Halflings, they spend a lot of time talking about this exact issue.
Mm,
Like, one of them was playing a halfling, and they're like, I'm black. I want to play a black character. And he was trying to find art, and he could only find one picture when he Google searched of a black
wow.
halfling. So they're like, this is something we should talk about. And the thing is, if I forgot what I was going for. What was I trying to
That's
say
what the
next?
thing is. I mean, I think you were just trying to say that yes, we need to like help diversify our worlds so that we see more things like black halflings and expand our minds because,
Oh,
like Jacob
yes.
said, like we can picture ourselves as halflings, but only white halflings. Let's
Yeah.
not get too crazy.
I can only be Frodo. So I think the reason there's so much pushback is people are like, but I'm comfortable with this. I know this. And a lot of the people who started in those spaces were probably cishet white guys. And they feel like their identities are being taken away. But that's not what we're saying at all. We're saying we want to welcome more people in with more identities and give them the opportunity to see themselves because you've already had that. And that's great. We'd like them to have that too.
I really like how you put that.
That was the point I forgot that I was trying to make.
Well, that was a good point. I'm glad you were able to bring that back up. Well, speaking of representation, then, is there such a thing as bad representation? And I don't just mean like blatant ableisms like racism or ableism, but any well-meaning attempts that maybe just fall flat. And how does that impact your ability to maybe see yourself in the game or what have you? Alex, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that there is a way that you can do bad representation that isn't like, problematic representation like you mentioned, where you're being
Mm.
ableist. But let's say that I say that I'm playing a black halfling, like we just said, and I'm like, oh yeah, my halfling's black, and then that's my character description. I'm like, oh, he's 3 feet tall, he's got an afro, he's black, and he's a monk. And then I play the game as I would normally, but I like never really. The point that he's black is like literally just a skin. You know what I mean? But I think that that representation isn't as good because we need to learn more about like what does it mean to be a black halfling in this world and like talk it out with the DM and try to learn more about the identities and culture and backgrounds of people that are black or whatever thing you're trying to represent and try to learn more about their backgrounds and cultures and identities so that you can represent them well and not like especially you don't want to like you said go into the problematic area and be like oh my black halfling loves fried chicken and watermelon. It's like oh no. But just learning more about the culture and background so that you can try to implement that into the world and make it more representative in that way as well.
Like rather than being a stereotype, like you're saying, like that.
Yeah.
Pepper,
Yeah.
do you have anything to say
Definitely don't
about
want to
that?
be a
Oh, I'm sorry, I
stereotype.
didn't mean that. Yeah.
And yeah, I think that I'm just trying to say, like don't just say your character's black and then ignore it, but also you don't want to like go the other way and be like, oh, they're black, so they are stereotypical, whatever.
Mhm.
I don't know. It's a hard topic to talk about because I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't want to sound like I'm being racist, but this is,
I have more things to add with that,
okay.
but we
All
can let
right,
Pepper
go ahead,
talk
Quinn. You
first.
make me. Quinn will make me sound better like she always does. That's why we do the podcast together.
That's awesome.
All right, go ahead.
Thanks.
What do you think, Pepper?
You can absolutely do representation badly, and it's a lot of the time it's kind of a fine line between just bad and just straight up going into isms. Stereotypes is definitely one of the places where I've seen it done badly, because I myself am transgender. I look for that kind of representation, and a lot of the time it ends up being, oh, trans woman, sex worker, and that's really all we know about her. And that's just so much more than that.
Mhm.
And it's just kind of rude, really. Or, we'll have let's say a trans man being played in a film by a cis woman, and I mean, I suppose you could say that they're pre-transition, but then in the story, that's just it's never brought up again. It's just, oh, they're trans. Okay, what else? Oh, nope, that's it. Next movie plot or whatever. So it's when you have that partial representation that's only just that very superficial attempt where I think is the most obvious that it's done badly, and where it does more harm than good.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I completely agree with that. That is a good point of like if you just say like I said, I think that kind of is what I was saying where it's like, oh, they're black and they like fried chicken, moving on. Or, not even that they like fried chicken, just like they're black and that's their character. Or, if you say, oh, they're trans and that's their whole identity, or they're disabled and that's their whole identity. It's like, well, you need to represent the whole person because as we've shown we all have different identities and backgrounds, and just because we're all three of us are blind, Jacob, Pepper, and I, doesn't mean that we have anything else in common. I mean, obviously we're here, so we have some things in common, but we're not just all generic blind. Oh, there's the blind person in the game. There you
Right.
go. We got represented.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Quinn, you said
so
you had something to
I
add.
have things that talk to both of these points. So it's important to remember you can't generalize a group of people like Jacob said earlier. Like when you introduce a character, everything they do and believe is coming from their own personal experience, and that's usually shaped by their culture, but no one is identical to anyone else. Everyone has a unique perspective and lived experiences that make them who they are. So like if, for example, I'm talking about an American, there's a huge range of cultural identities and religious beliefs just in this one country. So I can't just say that all Americans are white and Christian because I've met some who are. So we have to remember that just because you've met someone, you've met a single person. You've met a blind person,
Mhm.
you've met a blind person. You haven't met all blind people ever.
Yeah.
And another way to mess up representation is exactly what you guys were saying, is that you're not treating them as people. If they're just one dimensional, where the only thing about them is that they're black or asexual or use a wheelchair, you aren't treating them as a person at all, and you're just checking off a box.
Yeah, you tried to check it off, but you really just like pissed more people off.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say you just like you put a dot in the box.
Yep.
Yeah.
You didn't finish
It's-
filling it in, guys.
Yeah, those are
Yeah.
all, they're parts of the identity. Sometimes they're a big part. It's not the whole thing, though. There's
Mhm.
more.
Yeah, they're people that didn't talk about their interests. What do they like to do? What do they do for fun? What's their favorite color? We don't even know.
Mhm.
So that's again particularly interesting, and I hadn't necessarily written down this question, but I think this is as good a time as any because it popped up. Um, what kind of advice might you give to somebody who wants to play a character outside of their own identity? This is particularly salient for a game like mine, like Survival of the Able, where I'm asking people to play a disabled character, and not every player is disabled. And what would you say to them to put them at ease, to allow them to explore another identity without um, being worried or concerned that they're going to be stereotyping or commit some kind of blatant act of racism? Um, what kind of advice do we have for people?
So I think that one important thing is to make sure that, like, for example, if you're playing Jacob's game, you're playing it in a safe space where you have the opportunity to make mistakes and learn from them. Like, in a more public setting, you're going to get more backlash for every little thing you do
Mm,
wrong. So I think like doing it at a home game with some trusted, safe people is really important. And talking about those kinds of things before you start playing the game is really helpful. The other thing I'd say is try to talk to other people from different backgrounds and identities from your own and listen to them and care about them and treat them as people.
Yeah, that's awesome. Pepper, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Quinn, I really like that. To be honest, I think that's the best way to 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 go about it. Backlash, the amount of backlash seems to be related linearly to how public your work is. A game with friends, they might be mad at you. A game that's being streamed, people are going to be upset. You're putting out a video game or making a film. Oh, you do it wrong, you are going to piss off a lot of people. And I think that if you're trying to play somebody that is not quite you, it would certainly do you a little good to, do a little research. It doesn't have to be super well. It depends. If you're playing with friends, it doesn't have to be super in depth, and it helps if you have somebody who knows more about that. It's about talking to people. It's about getting to know them. But if you're, if you'd say be making a video game or a film, then you got to get a little bit more serious about the research. You got to do more. You got to talk to people. You got to, when you get up to a project that big, chances are you're going to have more of a budget to do that sort of thing. But if it's just a game with friends, have a safe space. It's okay to make mistakes in small settings like that. That's how we learn. Well, the thing that matters is that you learn from the mistakes and use that to do better in the future.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Alex, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think advice for anyone that wants to try playing a character that is different than yourself in maybe a bigger way, like an identity or a disability or something. Sorry, hiccuped a little bit. Is just give them some other character, like personality traits and quirks, so that it's like, oh, my character has a wheelchair, but they also juggle and they also, play the guitar or something like that. It's like now they have three things in there, and it's like, okay, yes, they have a wheelchair, but that's not their whole identity. They're also a guitar playing juggler, and that's like people are going to focus on that because that's like, wait, did they do them at the same time? And
That's
of
what I was
course
thinking.
they
How do you do all three at the same time?
Of course they do. But it's just something like that where it's like, look, I just off the top of my head came up with three personality traits, and one of them happened to be a person with a disability that is not my own disability. And like, look, I'm playing a character that's representing something other than myself, but I'm doing it, I think, in a more positive light where it's like, I'm not just, showing up and saying, "Oh, my character's in a wheelchair." And then they're like, "Okay, what else?" "Oh, they're a fighter." Okay. you know, give them something else too. Like it doesn't have to be juggling and guitar playing and wheelchairs, but it's just you get the idea.
They're really good at underwater basket weaving.
There you go. Now, is their head underwater too, or just their arms and body?
Just the fingers.
Just the fingers are
Sure.
underwater. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that brings me to the last major point here. How can we, as either players or creators, do representation better? And I know we've kind of talked about this a little bit here and there, but do we have any specific advice on how to improve as people who want to be more representative?
Yeah, so in order to have the most accurate representation possible, we need to bring in more diverse creators and players, if that's you're talking about playing an actual game, and give them a comfortable enough environment to give us constructive criticism and then actually listen to them and implement their feedback. Like if you just bring them in to have them but don't do anything with that, like you aren't you aren't going to learn anything from that. You aren't going to make yourself better. And you're really just, like we said, your actions are falling flat. And when you're creating a game, you have to give multiple examples of characters with a variety of identities from diverse backgrounds so that people can see, here's some examples of what some possibilities are. And then hopefully you've given enough examples that people can start to see, oh, I can be like this or whatever. And use that information to kind of form their own decisions about what kind of person they want to be playing.
Alex, what do you have to say about improving representation or how we can do better?
Okay, so I have mentioned a few times, trying to learn more about backgrounds and identities in different cultures than your own. And I
Mhm.
think that, or I guess I said that you should do that if you're going to play a person with a different, I don't know what to call it, a
Different
different
identity?
personality than your own or
Sure.
whatever. If you want to represent someone, then you should do things like read books and try to diversify the way that you read, or watch TV shows by creators of color, or that kind of thing. So I'm basically saying, try to learn about the cultures like Pepper mentioned earlier, and learn about trans people or learn about Black people, and you can do this by reading books written by them, and or watching TV shows made by them or whatever. And it or going to charity events where people with disabilities talk for an hour. uh, but it doesn't have to be like a book on race. It doesn't have to be, say you want to talk about race, that book. It could be a fantasy novel written by a person of color. So like one that I've read that I thought was cool was the Legacy of Orisha series by Tony Adam.
Tomi Adeyemi.
Yeah, I always say that name wrong, but I'm trying to learn. And like that book was a fantasy novel where all the characters are Black, and you like get a lot of. I think you learn a lot about Black culture, even though it's not about race and that kind of thing. You're
Mhm.
just reading a fantasy novel, and you're kind of subtly learning things that you didn't think you would. But so I think that's one way that people can really try to get better about learning about representation and representing different characters and different people.
Awesome. And Pepper, what would you have to say about how we can do better in representation?
I don't have much to add from my own experiences here. What I can say is listen to people, listen to their feedback, listen to their stories, listen to what they have to say, and use that to learn.
I love it. I think it's so important. And speaking of listening, um, how about we all listen to what you have to say about yourselves one final time? We'll go ahead and wrap it up, and maybe you can each tell us where we can find you or what it is you're doing online. Pepper, we'll keep it with you. Where can we find you if we want to get back in touch or find the work that you're doing?
Well, I main Twitter. I am at Pepper the Vixen, and I do Twitch. I do YouTube. I'm at Pepper the Vixen pretty much anywhere. And if you want to check out what I'm doing, my posts, my music, I've got my website, pepperthevixen.com. There is not much there yet. I am fairly new at this whole music thing, but it is quite fun. And I do very much enjoy talking about how to do it blind, so go ahead and stop on by if you so feel inclined to. And that's about it for me.
Awesome. Alex, where can we find you online?
Yeah, so I'm usually only on Twitter for my social media, and at Alex N Winterland. And then I make the podcast a couple of characters with Quinn, and like she said, we talk about D&D characters or other RPGs and topics related to role-playing games, like backgrounds and character quirks, that kind of thing. And sometimes we explore other games, like we did an episode with Jacob on Survival of the Able, and we've done a few other systems. So yeah, that's where you can find me, and Our website is a couple of characters podcast.com.
And Quinn, I know there's some overlap with Alex, but anything else you'd like to say, or where can we find you specifically?
Yeah, so you can find me at Not a Dr. Quinn. That's all spelled out. Pretty much on all the social media platforms. So, as Alex said, we make that podcast. It's a lot of fun just having a discussion about characters. Like sometimes we'll even just come in with a character that's just, oh, I want to make a bard that wants to make a vampire musical. And that was all we had. And we came in and made a whole character behind that and wrote an elaborate backstory. So that's a lot of fun. I do all of the editing for that, and I manage the website for that as well. And then I play Dungeons and Dragon types on that podcast, and that's D types on Twitter. And that's mostly it. It's where you can find me and the work I do.
Awesome. And I will say, a couple of characters podcast is absolutely fantastic. Everybody should go check that out. Well, thank you all so much for being here and for talking about representation in gaming. Thank you to all of our viewers and to everybody who's donated to our charity so far. We'll continue to stream throughout the rest of tonight and most of tomorrow. I will be streaming a game of Survival of the Able next up, just a little bit after the hour. So stay tuned, and we will see everybody again later.